Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. John Dallin. It is May 9th, 2018, and I say this every time, but I mean it more than ever. Today, we are going to have, I believe, one of those epic Mormon Stories interviews. If you go to mormonstories.org, you'll see a list of sort of the top 25 episodes of all time. And many of you won't need me to tell you what some of those are. The one with Tom Phillips, the one with Hans and Birgitta Mattson, the one with Christine Jepsen Clark, Grant Palmer, Richard Bushman, those sorts of interviews. And I'm confident that today has the potential to match up and stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the greatest interviews we've done. Today we are going to be interviewing Dr. Roger Hendrix. And it's a name that probably won't be familiar with most of you. And so I'm going to read his bio really quickly. Dr. Roger Hendrix is a management consultant, expert strategic planner, futurist, and author with a background in educational psychology. He is the author of 4 books. His latest book is titled Bend, Create, and Plan Your Future. Hendrix owns and operates a management consulting firm with an international clientele. He has authored more than 250 articles and has won 5 radio broadcast awards for his daily commentaries on social, political, and economic trends. And that will all be interesting, but there's more about why we're interviewing Roger. Roger has had a long and distinguished career serving within the LDS Church. He grew up in Southern California, but within a short amount of time, he began working for CES. In those very, let's just say, earlier years, he knew, for example, he had interactions with Paul Dunn and Jeffrey R. Holland as an institute teacher / director. I believe he ended up becoming an institute director at some point, so he'll be able to give kind of a CES background a bit. He's also served in many leadership positions in the church, including, I believe, in bishopric, stake presidencies, but most interestingly, he served as a mission president. So we'll be able to talk about his time as a mission president. And then also, he was definitely approached and discussed the opportunity to become an area authority, which would have become an entree into becoming a general authority. And then again, what's also very important and interesting about Roger is that he served on the board of Deseret Management Trust. And we're going to be talking about what that is, but it's a multi-billion-dollar trust that the church, operates. And he was called to that position by Gordon B. Hinckley himself, and he served there, I believe, for over 10 years. 18 years, yeah. So this is someone who has interacted with many, many general authorities, who has honestly operated at the highest levels of the church. We've probably never, even though we did have Hans Mattson on this show, and he was an area authority, I don't know that we've ever had someone on Mormon Stories with this level of interaction kind of at the highest levels of the church. But what's also just really fun with Mormon Stories is just hearing someone's story. So hearing Roger's journey as a young kid in Southern California, his battles with polio and other experiences in his life, all the way through to how coming to the church and what that meant to him, and kind of his fascinating and interesting life. That's going to be an important part of this interview. So it's just a really thoughtful, engaging, interesting story, even though there's going to be a lot of juicy tidbits along the way. So I am just really, really excited to have Roger. This is going to be one of those multi-hour epic interviews. It will probably go 4 or 5 hours total. We'll try and break it up into sections. So if you want to start with the section about, his time at Deseret Management Trust, or if you want to start with, his commentary on the modern church, we'll be able to let you jump to those points. But I think this is an interview worth hearing in its entirety. So before we actually jump into this interview, I just have a couple really quick announcements. Angela Soph, the singer-songwriter, is coming to Salt Lake May 17th. If any of you want to come hear her sing and talk about her latest album, which deals with her faith crisis, she's just a lovely singer-songwriter, and you'll really enjoy that evening. Again, that's May 17th, 2018. We're coming to Boise May 18th and 19th for one of those workshops where we're helping people and couples and families in their faith transition. If you are near Boise, I can promise you that this will help you in your life, with your mental health, with your marriages, with your families, with your relationships with believing family and friends. So please check out the Boise workshop if you're interested. We are also, that evening of May 19th, going to have just a social. So people who don't want to come to the workshop but want to just have fun and do some karaoke, you can come the evening of May 19th. We're going to have one of our epic 2.5-day retreats in Park City, June 8th through 10th. There are some slots still available there. Again, it's for helping marriages, helping people in a faith crisis, mental health, navigating a transition, all that stuff. Please join us in Park City for a wonderful event. We've got a beautiful venue lined up, so please check that out. Houston will be July 13th through 15th. Again, one of those retreats. Natasha Helfer Parker will be at both those retreats. Sam Young will be at the Houston one. He's been an important sponsor of that event. But we're going to have a lot of fun in Houston as well. And then Idaho Falls, August 10th through 11th, will be another workshop. And then, of course, we have our first cruise to the Bahamas, October 24th through 28th. Please sign up for our newsletter if you're interested at mormonstories.org. And you can always check out us on Twitter. You can check us out on Instagram at Mormon Stories. And we just really want to give a shout out to anyone who supports us financially. Our donors make all of this possible. So if you really value this programming, if you want to see it continue, please donate today. Go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, top right of the page. $10 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. We're transparent in our finances. In the U.S., donations are tax deductible, and all of the money goes literally towards the mission of the Open Stories Foundation, which is to support people experiencing or impacted by a religious transition. And we just really appreciate our donors who make this possible. So without any further ado, Roger Hendrix, it is such a pleasure to be joining you from the Alta Club in downtown Salt Lake City for this interview.
My hangout.
Yeah. Let's start with the question I probably don't ask everyone, and I know you've listened to a lot of our interviews, but let's start with a question I don't usually start with, which is, you know, you've operated at some of the highest levels of church headquarters. I'm looking out the window of the Alta Club right now, and I see church headquarters building right there. Why would somebody who served as a mission president, who served on the board of a really important, foundation for the church, why would you be willing to come on Mormon Stories and tell your story? Why would you want to?
Good question. First of all, because I wanted to, and I think all kinds of stories need to be told. I think you've had some very fascinating guys and gals on, from Greg Prince to Richard Bushman, and why not someone like myself who's had a rich history in church service, and I like Mormon Stories. I believe it is a healthy alternative to a lot of people who are spiritually fed by it. And I must, in full disclosure, when I first started listening to it, it was like going to church. It was spiritually edifying for me, and that was a time when a lot of these questions were coming out, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who is wrestling with them. I'm sure that the brethren were wrestling with them too. So it was kind of a golden age for all of us, and I felt that you were contributing greatly, and so I decided to come on and tell my story.
Well, we're really honored to have you with us, so thank you.
Thank you.
So, as we always begin, I want to begin kind of with your personal story and how Mormonism played a role in your early childhood years. But as we've, prepped a little bit for this interview, I wonder if talking about your bout with polio is the best place to start. Or if you want to start somewhere else, let's just dive into your early history.
Yeah, when I was 7 years old, I was hit with polio, and hit pretty severely with it, to the point where they had to come and pick me up. The ambulance had to come pick me up, take me to Los Angeles General Hospital. I was put into a ward of over 300 children, and I was next to one child who died 2 days after he and I were together. He was 7, I was 7, and I was isolated from my parents. And you would think it would be a traumatic experience, but little children respond very differently. They respond to the moment, and they can put the terrible experiences of the past, they can block that out and live in the moment. And so I wasn't necessarily sad. All I wanted to do was make sure my parents would visit me. But I was hit with polio, and in 1952, polio was still a very dreaded disease. In 1954, they came out with a Salk vaccine, so I missed by 2 years. It hit the right side of my body, my right leg. My right leg is smaller than my left leg, and I walk sometimes with a little bit of a limp and sometimes with a more pronounced limp. But from the time I was 7 to the time I was 19 and signing off to go to a mission, I was in clinics doing physical therapy, having doctors look at my leg and making decisions about operations. And I had a major surgery when I was in 9th grade. So I'm very familiar with polio. I'm very familiar with children who suffer from diseases. I know what it's like to be in a hospital, isolated from your parents, with other little children who are very sick. And so I've always been sensitive about that, have attempted to contribute to those causes. And that's about it at this point.
Were you LDS at the time you contracted polio?
Yes.
Okay. So did you have a pioneer ancestry, or?
Yes. My mother was 100% Dane, but she was born in the United States, 1910, in Mink Creek, Idaho. My grandparents and my great-grandparents migrated here as Mormon converts from Denmark in 1873. Now, at the time I was 7, I didn't know that, and we lived in Southern California, and my mother had just recently divorced a fellow who was not a Mormon, but was a Canadian. And so he was a first-generation Canadian. So I'm Canadian, I'm Danish, and born in Southern California. And my mother at that particular time was kind of a partier. So I grew up in a more liberal household, and but I knew I was LDS. Even though the church next door to me was the one I wanted to attend, when my mother found out I wanted to attend it, and it was a Christian church, she made sure that the primary president picked me up to take me to primary during the week. And so that's what started my activity in the church.
Did anyone try and give you a priesthood blessing to cure you of the polio? Was that ever thought of at the time?
Never received a blessing. Would not have known what that was.
So it wasn't a devout Mormon home?
No. My mother would say the typical things that Mormons do, that we believe in the Book of Mormon, that she made me watch General Conference, and I thought that was pretty cool, but it was kind of long. and she made sure I knew that she and Opal Packer, Boy Packer's older sister, that the two of them were buds. And so I got that kind of information. But my father left. I never met him. And so the men who came to the house to court my mother, none was Mormon. And finally she ended up marrying another non-Mormon, a good guy, my stepfather. And but that was about the extent of it.
So not an upbringing with family meeting every week and, scripture study every day and family prayer every day. It's kind of a single mom until your stepfather shows up, and he wasn't a member. So it would have been a more loose LDS sort of orthodoxy.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't an orthodoxy. But I was a famous kid in my school because my mother was the first person to be divorced. And so they would say, well, that's the kid of the divorcee. And my mother was a good businesswoman. She had apartments and condos behind our home. And she made her way, and she was confident about that. And as a result, I was very close with her. We were very tight. And
how did polio shape your character? How was it? Was it a defining moment for you? And if so, how?
I spent probably a third of my life trying to forget it and pretend I didn't have it. And when people would bring it up, I would sort of be put off by it because I tried every way possible not to have polio, not to mention polio. And then it started dawning on me maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago, that polio, more than probably any other event in my life, defined the character that was to come out. For example, I tried out for everything. And so I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, but got dropped from the Major League teams twice, had to play in the minor league. I had to play on minor league teams, which really bothered me because my friends tended to be very good athletes. And so I think they kind of tolerated me not being the athlete that they were, and me pretending that I was greater than I really was. And so I wasn't afraid to try out for things and then be told that I wouldn't make it. And so it was a process in my whole life of trying out for things. And eventually, I made some athletic teams, did well, and I would never have done that had I not wanted to overcome the polio and not accept it. I think that was the defining feature of my life for the first third of my life.
So you probably learned some resilience in that experience.
Yeah, I was resilience. Yeah, I was a resilient kid, but I also would not accept. There was denial. I would deny I even had polio. Now, later on, accepting that and plummeting the fact that I did have polio has been very enriching for me. But I grew up kind of a tough kid that way. I didn't care. I didn't care if people wouldn't accept me. I would demand that some form or fashion I would be accepted.
As far as the church's influence, well, no, let's go back. So you're in Southern California. What decade would have been your, late childhood, early adolescence? Give us a sense for the decade that you were kind of growing up in the church in Southern California?
I was a child of the late 50s and early 60s, went on my mission in 1964, so I would have been 19 in 1964. Graduated from high school in 1962, started high school, I think, in 1959.
Okay, so this would have been kind of the mid 50s where you're, Leave It to Beaver, kind of father knows best. This would have been the Eisenhower administration in the 50s that you were kind of a child, an early teen. You would have been listening to Elvis probably, and maybe Sam Cooke. This is before you would have been serving a mission right around the time the Beatles came to America. Is that right?
Yeah, you got that one right. The Beatles came to America in 1964, and I listened to the Beatles on every preparation day for 2 years. But I also grew up on the Beach Boys and Sam Cooke, that's right, and Bo Diddley and Johnny Otis. And so I was kind of a rock and roller kind of guy. Elvis Presley really became big in 1956 when I was in sixth grade. As for Eisenhower, he was elected in 1952, and John Kennedy was elected in 1960. And that's when I woke up, when John Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon, and the battles that ensued in my home on that election.
What was it like to be a teenager growing up in Southern California and to be a teenage Mormon? Was there surfing? What role did the beach play? And how was maybe your teenage years as a Mormon in Southern California, what we would expect versus different than, kind of the average teenage Mormon experience?
Yeah. Well, I was a beach rat. I surfed. I was a swimmer, a water polo player. So water played a big part of my life. Being in beach communities did. And as a result, I was pretty casual about the church. I can't remember the church pressing me. I can't remember it being heavy-handed. And at that particular time, not only was I determined to overcome polio, but I liked having fun. And so if there was a strict obedience to church rules and regulations, I was not into that. I was into, I was into what you did when you spent a lot of time at the beach. And I, for the life of me, I don't think the church bothered me. I enjoyed going to church because I had a lot of friends. And during that period of time, there seemed to be a lot of LDS youth who were Mormons. So I had a lot of friends in the church. I had more friends outside of the church. And the people I really hung with the most, and when I was dating in high school, were 99% of them were not Mormons. And so it was a casual time for me. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the church to the degree that I participated in it, and it didn't seem heavy-handed to me.
So David O. McKay would have been prophet during the late 50s, early 60s. Talk about what, activities, was there seminary for you? Were there, stake dances, war dances? Were there, road shows? To what extent was the church culture and the church activities and even church education, what role did any of that play in your teen years as a Mormon in Southern California?
Yeah. As I look back on it now, that was the epicenter of the social gospel. Most everything that I thought of when I think back on that time was social. Road shows, dances. I participated in all of those at a social level. And I actually one year went to seminary, And my seminary teacher ended up being my stake president. And all he did was, get up in front of the class, and we opened the Book of Mormon and read the Book of Mormon page after page and discussed it. And the people in the class were ninth graders to 12th graders. And there were about 25 of us. We hung together. We loved the seminary teacher. And I became very close to the stake president. And sometimes I think that the stake president, I used him as a surrogate father. He was a tough and rough guy, an athlete. I worked for him for a time after my mission. And so I was there, but he never asked me about the church. Nobody asked me about the church. When it was my time, it was my decision. My mother didn't press me. My father definitely didn't press me, and so I look back on that time and ask myself, where has that gone?
Where's what gone?
Where has the social gospel gone? And it's today. It's not like it was. And there was a definite change. And so I think that's worth probing, why that took place. But
let me just ask you, if it's okay, I don't want to totally interrupt, but if I were to give you a sentence, back then socially it was X versus now today it's more Y. How would you describe the social aspects back then versus how you perceive it to be now?
I think back then I felt they were, I thought they were friendly to me, and it was a friendly gospel. Now it's a gospel of obedience, and it's more serious. And there is a definite focus on knowing those scriptures and obeying the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Back then, and probably because I was younger, I felt like they cared for me. They didn't judge me. Now remember, I came from a family where there was a lot of drinking in my family, and people knew that my parents were partiers, and so as a result, you would think I'd feel somehow judged because of that, but I never did. I felt a very warm reception, and I was kind of a wild kid. So I can't remember them criticizing me for being wild. I was just there having fun.
So this would have been the time that Joseph Fielding Smith was really active. Bruce R. McConkie would have been coming on the scene around this time. Mark E. Peterson would have been alive. Ezra Taft Benson would have been sort of, in the Eisenhower administration and soon to be an apostle. Some would say some of those apostles would have been the most hardcore we've ever had. And so you wouldn't think that the late 50s, early 60s to mid 60s would be more casual. You would think it would have been super strict and harsh. So how do we square your experience of things being more casual, more fun, with who was kind of leading the church at the time?
Well, the person leading the church was David O. McKay, and one of his counselors was Hubie Brown. And so David O. McKay, he was a central figure in changing the church. You would have Joseph Smith, you would have Brigham Young, and then you fast forward to David O. McKay, who was tipping that balance, not so much what you can do for the church, but what the church can do for you. And then you had a very competent liberal man who was his counselor in Hubie Brown. So up until like 1966, 67, I didn't feel any pressure coming from the Quorum of the 12. I'm not even sure I was fully aware of what the Quorum of the 12 was, because so much of the focus was on David O. McKay, even to the exclusion of his counselors. David O. McKay was a big player, and he was talked about in magazines, and Cecil B. DeMille became good friends with David O. McKay. So I felt a very warm, I felt the church was very warm that way, and I felt that the church was out to help me meet my needs.
How much was Mormon doctrine an influencer in those teen years? So you think about what would have come out with Bruce R. McConkie and Joseph Fielding Smith's doctrines of salvation and all these teachings that now the church is backing away from blacks being less valiant than pre-existence, to the 12 tribes of Israel, the signs of the times, like Adam and Eve and the 6,000-year earth, and just all this sort of Mormon fundamentalism that we are shedding now, but that really rose to prominence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. How much of that would have shaped your Mormonism as a teen when you were in seminary? Were you exposed to that kind of stuff? Was that an important part of your worldview?
No. Again, when I was in high school, I wouldn't call my activity in the church being active. I was very involved in sports and in high school activities. And so, with the exception of knowing about David O. McKay, I didn't know about those things. And as a matter of fact, I didn't really care about them. It wasn't until my second year in college that I didn't have a faith crisis. I had a college crisis, and then I went to an institute class, and had a spiritual experience there. And so my thing was, well, I've got to give up smoking cigars, the word of wisdom, if I'm going to buy into this thing. I've got to give up, drinking beer, and that means giving up some of my friendships. And I said, well, I'm willing to do that because at that particular time, under the conditions, I was searching for more discipline, more meaning in my life, and boom, the church gave it. And they already received me and liked me, so just becoming more active was a very natural thing. I think people thought, well, Roger will come around sooner or later, and Roger did come around.
Talk more about that spiritual experience. That was pre-mission, right?
Pre-mission.
And you were what university again?
I was I was at Long Beach City College for 1 year because a guy by the name of David Ems, who was the creator of the South Coast Repertory Group, it's a world famous regional theater now, and he was the director. I followed him because in my second semester of high school, I decided I want to be an actor. And so I got an agent, was in Hollywood, very condensed. I dated a girl who was a model and got me appointments to go to interviews, to model for magazines. Not that I was picked up that much, but at least that exposed me to the network of actors in Hollywood. And then it was recommended that I go under David Ems. I did. I had an enormous time, got supporting leads in comedies and in dramas. And then David Ems got a bunch of his buddies from San Francisco State to do a summer stock theater to see if they wanted to break off and create a professional theater there in Southern California. And the play was La Ronde. It was about German sexual mores It was very controversial, and it was a repertory group, so I had as much stage time as the rest of these guys who were professionals, and I loved it. But then, a series of things. I didn't make the lead in a play I thought I should. That bugged me, and so I kicked out of school pretending to be sick, and it was a crisis, and so I was invited to go to an institute class taught by Glade Bergen, and it was a Book of Mormon class, and he showed slides, and I can't even remember the slides he showed, but it seemed reasonable, and I was looking for something, and then I was just sitting there, and I felt really good. I felt different than I usually felt, at peace, and right then I made a bargain with myself. Well, now, if I go full bore with this, what do I have to give up? So you give up your stuff, and you go full bore into the church. And like 6 months later, it seemed like maybe 7 or 8 months later, I was in Cordoba, Argentina, or I was at BYU learning Spanish, and then shipped off to Cordoba, Argentina, and that was the start of a cool life.
Before we jump to your mission, in reading your notes in preparation, you had mentioned that you had an encounter with a serial killer. Can you just tell us about that really quick?
Oh my gosh.
This is pre-mission, right?
This was when I was in 7th grade.
Okay.
And now, remember, I was a guy who liked to joke and kid and had friends. And so in 7th grade, we were in a general music class, listening to classical music. My buddy and I got into a pencil fight where you mark each other off up with a pencil, and my pencil broke. I went up to sharpen my pencil. I came back. He had his pencil on my seat, and it stabbed me. And so I had to, I was actually stabbed. They had to pull the pencil out of my rear end, and I had to go to the nurse's office. A doctor was called in to look at me, and they said, well, you have a big puncture there, but you can't suit up for gym in 7th period. And so that caused me to have to go fold towels 7th period in 7th grade. And this new guy that came to the school was a 9th grader. His name was John Lawrence Miller. And and we started talking, and he had been in reform school, just got out, and they put him into that junior high where I was, and so I was kidding around with him, and he throws me on the stack of towels, and he puts towels over my face, and he won't let me up. And I'm losing my ability to breathe, and then I just went wild and started pulling the towels off and started screaming and yelling, and finally I made it out of there, and I told the gym teacher, this guy, not only was I stabbed in class, but this guy has tried to smother me, and then. A year later, John Lawrence Miller had killed a 22-month-old baby by smothering the baby, and then he went to prison, and then he got out 15 years later and killed his mother and father, and so he became a serial killer, and I was one of those that maybe was testing out his ability to take life. And I was lucky. I was very lucky. And that's interesting you bring that up. You want to know what happened to my stab wound?
Yeah. Is it still there?
It is. There's a mark there. That's right. Okay. All right.
So you end up serving a mission in Argentina. I imagine that spiritual experience you had in Institute left you really devout. Is that true, or was it a complicated mission service for you? Was it hard to get you could take the boy out of California, but could you take the California out of the missionary boy?
No, I was pretty much the same, but I worked hard. And I've always been a hard worker, mowing lawns for dough and that type of thing. So I always like to have, I had a habit of working hard when I worked. And so when you got to the mission, I was assigned to a guy by the name of Marion Dean Anderson, who has passed away a couple years ago. And he was the top baptizer in the mission, and he was the fastest bike rider I'd ever seen, and we would zip from place to place. He was happy, and he lived in Redondo Beach. He just lived over a couple of cities over from me. So it was two Southern California guys. He didn't take things too seriously, but he worked hard. I worked hard. We had a lot of baptisms, and the guys I hung around with and he hung around with were Californians. So there were a lot of Californians in the mission. And so I felt comfortable, and more than anything else, in 1964, we were starting to get into a lot of homes because of the Second Ecumenical Council of Pope John. And when he said, take all the saints out of the churches, and he opened up the dialogue, people became disenchanted with the Catholic Church, and we were getting into a lot of places, and we were teaching the gospel to a lot of people that wouldn't have let us in before. It was a great time for me. And then and my mission presidents were unusually fascinating guys, so I thrived there. I worked hard, baptized a lot of good people. I had certain goals. My first mission president would publish the baptisms for the month and who did the baptizing. My second mission president didn't do that. I liked that. And so all I had to do was work, preach, love, have fun.
So you would have, later you end up serving as a mission president in Chile during a time when the church was going crazy with baptisms, and ironically, you would have been serving a mission around the time that the baseball baptism furor would have first broken out in England. The same place where Jeffrey Holland served, where Woodbury would have been a mission president, where they would baptize hundreds, if not thousands, of kids if they joined a baseball, if they joined a baseball team, and they would have ended up having to go back and excommunicate, hundreds, if not thousands, of these youth that were baptized without parental consent. It was sort of this first awakening of the kind of scandalous baptisms that have plagued the church, in my opinion, and especially have plagued Latin America. Would any of these baseball baptism sort of practices have been, used in Argentina during your time as a mission president, or would you have heard of these sort of baseball baptism episodes back when you were serving?
Yeah. When I was a missionary, I had never heard of that stuff. When I was a mission president, and remember, Jeff Holland was 4 years older than I was, and so that period of time where he was a missionary and went to London and served under Marion Hanks, and they were kind of cleaning up that baseball baptism era. And so I never heard about that.
So would you had crazy baptisms on your mission, like 10 or 20 a month kind of thing, or a mission with 700 baptisms or 1,000 baptisms a month, or would it have been a lot less back then?
As a missionary,
Yeah, as a
full-time.
missionary, yeah.
No, we wouldn't have had that many baptisms. Your top baptizer for the 2 years would have been someone like McKay Winkle or Marion D. Anderson, and they would have maybe, they wouldn't have had 100 baptisms.
In their whole mission?
In their whole mission.
Okay.
And when I was a mission president, sometimes we had a lot of baptisms.
Right. Okay. All right. So anything else about your mission before we talk about post-mission life? Anything you want to share about what it meant to you? Any spiritual experiences? To what extent it was formative in your life? Anything you want to say about your mission before we move on?
Great confidence.
Confidence booster?
Oh, yeah. Because I have polio now, and I was doing my thing in high school and in college and was making my way, but really the mission proved a huge confidence builder for me. I went in nervous, and my parents went in nervous, thinking maybe I couldn't make it. I was too sickly. But by the end of my mission, I could go any place in the world. They could drop me off on the corner, give me a couple of bucks, and I could make my way. I was a street elder, liked getting out, liked talking to people, liked eating off the street, the vendors, the hot dogs, having a steak. And in Argentina, steak and French fries, and a little pond for dessert. I love doing that. I like just being outside. And as a result of being kind of jovial and being a talker, I met a lot of people, taught a lot of people, and I love being a missionary. I know how to do it. I like joking around. I like getting close. And my thing was I like baptizing men. And there's a certain rhythm to Latin men. If they know you respect them and you like being with them, they give you the benefit of the doubt. And so I can't think of anything that was not beneficial for me. And if you don't even get credit for your baptisms, you're just preaching the gospel. What's there not to like about that?
Would you have had leadership positions as a missionary?
Yeah, I was a zone leader, and in those days, like on a mission, in our mission, there were 4 zone leaders, and there were 42 missionaries in my zone, and they also had the rule, as a zone leader, don't go out and help the elders in your zone, and they did away with traveling elders. Have them come in and see you work. And so as a zone leader, you really had to you had to be on point. You had to be out there working. There was no hiding the truth about what you did or did not do. And so to me, it was a very authentic experience. And I was a zone leader for most of my mission in Cordoba, Argentina, right next to the mission headquarters.
Beautiful. What would your mission experience have done to your testimony?
What would it have done to it?
What did it do to your testimony? Yeah.
I had it. It's not as though you have a little bit of it and then you get more of it. In that institute class, boom, I had it. And so I had it, and it neither waned nor grew. It was just there. And so I thought I was sad. I was, willing to go through all the sacrifices you have to go through as a missionary. Cold weather, cold showers, people slamming doors in your face. I can't remember those. I can just remember the doors that were open to me.
Okay. So your testimony was there from that institute moment forward.
Yeah, and you know, I I memorized those 6 discussions, and
Back then you memorized them word for word, right?
word for word.
There wasn't the preach my gospel thing or the 6 discussions that were just kind of flip charts. There was
You memorized them, and you had you had a flannel board, and you put little images on the flannel board that stuck on the flannel board, and so I would pack the flannel board in the back of my bike or in my backpack, and I was off, and I would teach outside as well as inside, and in Latin America, you don't start your good teaching until about 10 o'clock at night. And so, I never worried about my get up time. I just got up when I got up, took my shower, wasn't real obsessed about getting into the scriptures. And that was a time when Bruce R. McConkey's Mormon Doctrine came out, and it was sort of like a secret Bible, and missionaries would buy it. And what Mormon Doctrine did was it gave an encyclopedic knowledge of the gospel with a very conservative interpretation. And so missionaries could, all the questions they had, they'd look up the topics in Mormon Doctrine, and for some reason it had a very deep mystique. But I wasn't too much into that. I was into those 6 lessons, getting out, meeting people, working, getting it done.
This is a really detailed question, but what were some of the figures or images on the flannel board, just so we get a sense of what types of visuals you would show on the flannel board?
Oh my gosh, like on that first lesson, it would have the primitive church, and then...
would it just show like Baroque buildings or like...
Catholic.
Catholic.
It kind of showed a pyramid building.
Okay.
And what you did is at a certain time you would ask questions like, well, if the priesthood was lost, what would happen to the church? And they'd say, well, it would, it wouldn't be true. And yeah. And you'd rip the church down, say desplomo, it crashed. And they go, whoa, lands, and you could be pretty dramatic about that. And so I always enjoyed doing that. And then, the word of wisdom, oh my gosh, the word of wisdom. That was always a big one. And then the
So like alcohol on the flannel board or like coffee and tea on the flannel board?
You had those little cutout images that you would stick on there. You can't drink alcohol.
Or coffee, right?
Or coffee.
What's that like telling an Argentine that they can't drink wine or coffee?
Well, coffee's okay, but, the tea and the vino is a big one. And when you get to tea, your voice would kind of go down, thinking, maybe they won't hear me, but tea, they go, well, what about mate? Well, what about it? And then it became a big deal. Well, do we baptize people who drink mate? And I'd tell my junior candidates, well, don't ask the mission president. Mate is just a bunch of leaves and hot water and sugar in there, and it doesn't taste that good. And so just tell them alcohol, coffee, tea, tobacco. Now, Argentines weren't big smokers, but they were big wine drinkers and big mate drinkers. And so, when people who got into the church like I did, many of them were searching for something. They were having their own crisis, not usually a spiritual crisis, but maybe a professional crisis. And there were plenty of those in Argentina during that period of time because people were moving in from the farms to the urban areas. And so there were just a lot of crunch of people, and you had to fight for employment. And so like one guy who was a very gifted guy, he was in their Air Force Academy, and he got tossed out of the Air Force Academy. For what reason, I don't exactly know. And so we knocked on the door. His mother answered the door, and she invited us in. And her son came out, and her son was depressed because he got bounced out of the Air Force Academy. So whether you didn't get the lead as a theater arts guy, or whether you got bounced out of the Air Force Academy, everybody is looking for something. And so this guy, when we told him, we got to the word of wisdom, no wine, no coffee, no tea. They do the same thing that I did. I'm feeling something good here. And what do I have to give up for that? Well, this thing that I'm feeling right now with these missionaries is better than being depressed. I have meaning again. And so they make that trade-off. And so it's really not as hard as you think for those people who are searching for something. And at that particular time, the gospel was a very exciting thing. The young missionaries were very excited. Argentina was on fire because of the Second Ecumenical Council. So a lot of people were looking for...
Because that caused disruption in the Catholic Church, and people started asking questions, wondering if the church was true, and the Catholic Church.
Yeah, Pope John was challenging the traditions of picking a saint and worshiping a saint, and taking saints out of the walls in the chapels and being more open, and that disrupted people. Plus, the Catholic Church was not popular. The priests were being criticized, and at that particular time, they were being criticized for having sex and then hiding the babies, that type of thing. And so people were disenchanted with the Catholics to begin with. And then when all of this disruption came, people were looking for something. It felt like their anchors were being pulled up, or that their suspicions were being validated. And so that was a good time for people like myself.
And last question about the flannel board: Would you have had Joseph Smith's first vision, the Godhead, Jesus and God up there?
All of it.
All that stuff.
Yeah, and we carried those little images in little envelopes, and we took them out. We'd put them on the flannel board as we got to them, and now they have flip charts, don't they?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably better. But I enjoy putting those little images on the board, especially and if the priesthood left, and what happens to the church? Well, it falls. That's right, and you were able to make it fall, and you'd say desplomo. Oh, yes.
Before we take our first break for our first episode, talk to us just quickly about coming home and getting married and any early schooling you did, kind of your life up until going to work for CES, kind of what happened between your mission and going to work for CES. We'll start episode 2 with your time as CES and onward.
So I came home.
By this 66?
66.
So the Beatles were hippies by then. This is Rubber Soul Revolver time. Drugs were starting to come in. This is pre-Woodstock, right?
That's right. And so I went to Cal State Long Beach. And again, by this time, my mother, for some odd reason, was worried about me. So she wanted me at BYU. She didn't want that glow of that mission to fade on me. So she wanted me to go to BYU.
She liked what the mission did for you.
They loved it. They loved it. And my friends, their biggest fear. Now remember, most all of them were non-Mormons. They said, Roger, we don't want you to lose your big mouth. And I'd always get offended at that, big mouth. But I told jokes. I was irreverent. I was loud, and so I came home, and I didn't lose any of that. So I was able to start connecting, and my mother liked what she saw. My stepfather liked what he saw.
Even though he's a non-member.
Even though he was a non-member, I was happy and
Confident.
very confident, and so they wanted to ship me up to BYU. And
Just give them more Mormon stuff. More Mormon.
yeah,
Turn up the Mormon.
You are really a Mormon, Roger. And so, but I didn't want to go. So I stayed at Cal State Long Beach. It was only a couple miles from my home. And then I had to make a decision whether to stay in theater arts or not, because I already had a minor in theater arts by that time. And
You in your notes, there was something about Kramer from Seinfeld and acting. Is that a story that needs to be told or not?
don't read it. I don't
It
read
says Kramer on Seinfeld and Sterling Holloway. Is that a story?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, when I had an agent in Hollywood, I saw myself as kind of a leading man. Tab Hunter was very popular during that time, but when I'd go to have my photos taken, and you have to put together a portfolio of your photos and the plays you were in, and I got an agent, and my agent who would give me acting lessons before I went in for a particular audition would say, now, I want to compare you to some of the actors I know. And he said, first of all, I want to compare you to an animal. And so I, German Shepherd, they go, you're a greyhound. Greyhound, skinny, long-nosed greyhound. So I didn't like that. And he says, and you remind me of Sterling Holloway. I go, Sterling Holloway? This was the guy who played William Bendick's Life of Riley's neighbor, who had a squeaky high voice. And he was, who was that Disney character? Or he was the voice of Pooh.
Right. Yeah.
And so
kind of a scrawny guy, kind of scrawny, pudgy.
And I met Sterling Holloway. He was thin, and he had this strawberry red hair that was piled like this, and so that started bugging me, how they saw me and how I saw myself.
Yeah.
Now remember, as a polio victim, you tell yourself all kinds of stories about who you are to kid yourself, to not face, some of these handicaps you have. So when they introduced me to Sterling Holloway, this is who you look like. That was kind of a downer. And then later on, in my management consulting days, I was giving a lecture and being introduced, and the guy who's introducing me says, and you're going to really enjoy Roger. He reminds me of Kramer on Seinfeld. And Kramer is a stitch, but you know how he'd run in, skid, and be nervous. I said, they see me more comedically than seriously.
Yeah.
Now, how can that be? Okay.
But I can see that this polio made you really conscious about appearance. Is that fair to say? Just not only your appearance, but other people's appearances. And is that fair to say? Not in a bad way, just kind of a side effect.
Well, I sigh only because it's so true. Yeah. That's always been. I always wanted to have the best clothes. I was always conscious about the clothing, the people I was around, what they were wearing. Appearance was very important to me. Yeah. That's right. I've tried to get away from that, but my wife this morning said, well, John's going to be interviewing you, right? Yeah. What are you dressing up for? This is just how I am.
Yeah. So tell us about how you met your wife and getting married, and anything else before your CES years that you want to say.
Yeah, so you get home, you date a lot, and either they don't like you or you don't like them, and so I went to a snow party.
Snow party?
During semester break of the first and second semester of college, all the colleges convened up in Arrowhead, and it was snowing, so a snow party.
Okay, got it.
And so during that time, this is when tea grouping was popular, and the church was coming out against tea grouping, but the institute instructors liked tea grouping. It's where you got around, kids got around in a circle, and they told all their secrets, their inhibitions, and
Vulnerability, basically.
vulnerabilities.
Of course the church hated that.
But that didn't stop us. And so we're up there in Arrowhead, and so I'm in this circle, and I've dated, and some of it's been successful, some of it hasn't. So we're in this tea grouping, and we go around, and this girl said, well, I'd like to get to know Roger better. And I looked at the girl, and I looked at my buddy, and I said, did she say that about me? She wants to get to know me? And he said, yeah. So right after that tea group, I went over and I said, I'm Roger. And she says, I'm Sherry. And we started dancing, and 6 months later we were married. She had only been a member of the church for 5 months.
Oh, wow.
And we hit it off. We didn't have one argument. She was very chilly. She was very smooth and soft, and I was very intense and loud, and we made a great couple. The opposites really attracted. Not one argument. And we had to go through getting her temple clearance because she hadn't been a member long enough. And we went through that, and that's where my stake president comes in, where he strong-armed Salt Lake City to get permission for us to be married in the temple. And
why? Because it was before a year?
Before a year of
Full membership.
Before a year of having been a member of the church.
Okay.
And I liked the idea that she was a convert. I liked the idea that she had similar experiences that I had in high school and college. So we knew each other. Our parents came from similar backgrounds, and it worked. I've never thought of this quite this way, but when I was dating girls whose fathers were really active in the church, whose parents were really active in the church, I felt uncomfortable with the strictness of that. And it wasn't anything overt and real obvious to me, but her parents were not. She came from a non-Mormon family, but very tight. And so she was relaxed, and I was who I was, and we hit it off, and we've been married 51 years.
Congrats.
5 kids, 16 grandchildren. You know the story.
Tell us her name again.
Sherry.
Sherry.
Darlene Fannin Hendrix. She's really into the Fannin thing now.
Okay.
Because she's Irish.
All right. Hi, Sherry. Shout out to Sherry. I've met Sherry a couple times.
Hi, Sherry.
Really quickly, you and Sherry would have gone through the temple and had an endowment experience very different than what someone going through the temple would have experienced, let's just say post 1990. Do you want to talk about what it was like for you?
Oh, no.
As a California kid to go through the endowment back when a lot of those Masonic relics, I mean, there's still a ton of Masonic relics, but the really severe ones, I'm not asking you to talk about anything you're uncomfortable, but How did the temple strike you as a surfer kid from Southern California who liked the Beatles and Elvis? Was it jarring, or did you just really not even notice it? All the penalties and the that sort of thing.
Again, that didn't bother me. I thought it was symbolic. I'm not going to kill myself.
Yeah.
Hey, this is a point that may be really germane to our whole interview. I wasn't into the obedience thing. I was into the progress thing. And so the church gave me an avenue to personally progress. That's what I was into. And they had different stages and levels that you could attain. And each level, each ecclesiastical call you got, that was a confirmation of my personal progress. On the other hand, this idea of the stuff we did in the temple, to me, was just like a fraternity initiation, and it was old, and it didn't bother me. Now, I promised my wife that I would not say anything about her, but the temple ceremony, she said, what did we just experience there? and so that was the first time I was aware that there was anything bizarre or unseemly or compromising in the temple ceremony. It was cool because it pushed me forward. Then I could put on the garment. Then I could get the Melchizedek priesthood. Then I could be a missionary. And then I could work myself up into leadership. And that's the type of guy I was. Again, I think it goes back to the polio. These were confirmations that I had value, and the church filled that. So maybe I looked at the church a little more like the YMCA. And I use that analogy a lot.
What do you mean by that? Because most people have not been to a YMCA these days. They just think of the Village People song, YMCA, and they probably think of gay men. But what do you mean by the YMCA in an early 60s context?
The YMCA was a very powerful young men's Christian association where kids in junior high and high school would join clubs that were sponsored by the YMCA. And for me, that's what got me into swimming. And so, I'm being cut from baseball teams and football teams because of this handicap. But then I went and I tried out for the swim team. Boom, I made it. And then, and so the why was a big thing in my life because it helped me accomplish something. Now, from the Y, I then swam AAU, and from AAU, I then started high school swimming and became a varsity high school swimmer and a record holder. And then I played water polo, which was very rough, and I perfected a certain kind of shot as a water polo player. And so I looked back at the Y and said, these guys gave me a start. This is progress. And so when I decided to go full bore with the church, that was like the why to me. That was the extension of that, where I could accomplish things. Now, there's another side to the church, the doctrine and the obedience. And
the authority, right?
The authority. The church doesn't exist for you. You exist for the restoration. And so as I continued to go up in church position, I think I had to come to grips with that a lot more.
Final question before our break. How did you process the civil rights movement as a Mormon in the mid-'60s when Martin Luther King had been assassinated, as Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, as Lyndon B. Johnson passes the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and all the protests in Selma and Montgomery, and what did the civil rights movement mean to you as a Mormon in the mid '60s?
That's when a little bit of tension started entering in, because the neighborhood I came from and the culture I grew up in, we were pro-civil rights, and we were taught we were all equal. The Long Beach Unified School curriculum and its social studies and history program was very pro-civil rights. And so I grew up thinking that racism, social injustice was a Southern thing and not a Southern California thing. And we'd always say that, hey, that's down the South. You know, we don't have any bigotry or racism here in Southern California. We're all equal. And then Watts happened. They literally burned down the city, and 34 kids were killed. And then all of a sudden we realized we're a part of this. And that's right when I got back from the mission, and that's right when the Latter-day Saints Student Association came about as a creation of Paul Dunn. And we felt emboldened to participate and to be liberal if we wanted to be liberal, and that the racial tensions were as much here in Southern California as they were down in the South. And then that's when you started getting a pushback. That's when Ezra Taft Benson and the John Birch Society started becoming very prominent. And that's when the tension between people like Hubie Brown and Ezra Taft Benson were taking place. And so I had to start giving those things deeper thought, because I tended to be more liberal. In fact, I was more liberal. But the church gave me that space, especially in college with the establishment of the Latter-day Saints Student Association. That was very big. That was the student equivalent what David O. McKay did for the entire church.
So you felt like in the mid '60s you could be kind of liberal or progressive and still be Mormon?
Yeah.
And did you think of yourself as disagreeing with the church's policy on blacks, or just not understanding it? You know, did you have to come to an internal resolution, or did you just put it on the shelf and avoid it?
I started speaking out, in institute classes and at home and at church, and there seemed to be room for me to do that. In church, I spoke about Martin Luther King's assassination. I spoke about Lyndon B. Johnson in the liberal progressive legislation he passed after the assassination of John Kennedy. And I knew there were people in the congregation who didn't agree with me. I knew that there was this fellow that's when I started becoming aware of the 12 apostles, this very powerful apostle who was in the Eisenhower administration who didn't agree with me. And then all of a sudden, I began to find out that the blacks couldn't have the priesthood. And so I talked openly about it. But no one threatened to take away my temple recommend. No one threatened me. And as a matter of fact, I went through a series of interviews with Marion G. Romney, and to be in the church education system, and he asked me about that, and I said I don't believe in bigotry. I don't believe in racism. And his quote to me was in this interview, well, if you think any of the brethren are racist, that's just a bunch of poo-poo. And I said, what? He said it just like that. I said, well, then we agree. And so I was never a shrinking violet on those issues, but neither did I feel threatened back then.
And it didn't cause you to doubt your testimony?
No, remember, you have to understand that as long as I was progressing, that was the testimony. It was like the YMCA. As a human being, I had meaning. And so I divided the church and its program of progress for me, separate from the doctrine. And I always thought the doctrine was traditional, archaic, pioneer stuff. And I thought what I was involved in was the modern stuff, where we were going.
Right, right. All right, we're done with part one of our interview with Roger Hendrix. Roger has done a lot of cool things, including working in CES, being a CES director, being a mission president, including time as bishop and stake presidencies, and most notably served on the board of the Deseret Trust Company for 18 years, which is a very significant multi-billion-dollar foundation that the church runs. So we are going to please join us immediately for part two, where we're going to be talking about his time with CES, his ascent, his continual ascent through the church hierarchy, through various priesthood offices, all the way up to being a mission president. We're going to talk about eventually him beginning to have the discussions about becoming an area authority, which he declined to pursue that track, which would have put him on the track of becoming a general authority.
Oh my gosh.
And we'll talk about him being called by Gordon B. Hinckley to serve on the Deseret Trust Company and what that was like for 18 years. We'll talk about his personal experiences with many, many general authorities, which will be fun. And then we'll conclude with his own faith journey and where he is with the church and his commentary on the modern church. So we've got a lot of cool things ahead. Please stay tuned soon for part two of our interview with Dr. Roger Hendrix. Thanks, everybody.